and we were actually just finishing up reviewing the some of the chapters this week. So it's come along. And so I do some other things too, but I might bring that up later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I apologize for being a few minutes late. My name is Brian Kempton. I needed to bring my daughter home from a doctor's appointment. She's fine, but working from home continues. So thank you for your patience, and thank you, Blessing, for sort of kicking us off here for our Policy and Advocacy panel. I'm the Director of Career Services and Alumni Relations at the School of Public Policy at Maryland. So I spend all of my working time getting students jobs and internships in the policy field across all sectors, especially within the DC area. I'm very familiar, Raymond, with CRS. It's one of Maryland's top employers for students. There's a lot of our alums, School of Public Policy's employers for students. There's a lot of our alums that go there. So I thank you all for your attention. We're going to go and get a little bit more into some specifics. I'm not sure how Blessing asked you guys to sort of talk about yourselves. Did she ask you to give you sort of a brief elevator pitch to get started? Is that sort of what she said? Okay, cool. I think I'd like to do, at least for the first 20, 25 minutes, a little bit of a round robin for a few other questions that I have in the back of my mind about your time at Maryland, your transition to the workforce, and some of the pearls of wisdom you'd like to impart to students who are still at Maryland. And I think the first thing I'd like to start off with is looking back on your time at Maryland. You know, it's very easy to talk about, especially if you really are happy with where you've been, all the ways that it prepared you to do the work that you're doing now. I'd like for you to take a little bit of a different tack on that and sort of look back on your time at Maryland and advise some of our current PhD students here today on things you wish you had done differently, knowing what you know now, right? Now that you've made the transition to the workforce and you've successfully moved on from College Park, if you could go back in time and talk to and do things over, or tell these students a little bit about what they might want to take advantage of, what are some of the things you might point to kind of give them some guidance? Anybody can start.
Well, I'll jump in. So I would say the first thing that I've already spoken to several UMD doctoral students through a different panel that Susan had organized through the Career Center. So if you want, you can look that up on YouTube. Believe it's there, where I talk a lot about the need to work on your writing skills in order to be very successful in like science policy or in advocacy in general. I would say writing skills are definitely very important. So that would be the first thing that I would point towards, is just like the need to really focus in on your writing. And but I want to direct you to that YouTube video for that comment. The thing that I'm thinking now is that I really wish I had done a lot more networking. And I don't just mean going to happy hours and meeting people, but I mean like creating sustained contact with scholars outside your own field, and then seeing the ways in which you could leverage those relationships to make useful products that you can exhibit on your CV or your resume. By that, I mean joining your professional societies or other societies. Alessandra is also a member of the National Science Policy Network, and yeah, and so we'll pub that one. But through that group, for example, like I've made a lot of connections, and then you can work on products or writing or you know, advice to Congress together, and then use that and illustrate how you've built leadership skills and things like that. And when I was in grad school, I really felt confined to my field. I also felt confined to my research project, and I was, you know, I wasn't seeking collaboration outside of my PIs or even outside my field. And I think that that's something that I wish I could go back and do, because now that I'm out of grad school, I'm doing that now for my own professional development. So that would be something I would primarily encourage.
My recommendation is kind of along the same vein, but it's more, so as a graduate student, there are opportunities accessible to you that do not exist for anyone else. So for example, NSPN is primarily graduate, so it's the National Science Policy Network. It is almost entirely graduate students, and there are things, specifically awards inside NSPN, that do not exist for people who are no longer students. There are internships that do not exist or are very difficult to get if you are no longer a student. For example, the Mirzayan Fellowship, you can do that in the middle of your PhD. You can also do it after, but it's a little, they tend to prefer people who are in the middle. There are just tons of different opportunities that are for early career researchers, which is defined differently by every organization. So it can be anywhere from 2 to 10 years post PhD. So it's basically like time is ticking. The second you graduate, you have less and less opportunities. So starting during helps because it gives you more time to like really figure out what you're interested in, so you can look into it, talk to people about it before you start feeling that pressure, like, crap, this is my last year to apply. Things like the Presidential Management Fellows, 2 years post-degree, no later. So starting early on some of those things that have time limits is pretty important. And that's one of the things, like, I started discovering policy was my interest, I think 2 years before I defended, but I didn't have the time, or I didn't perceive to have the time to do it. So I left a lot of it till the very end. And some things I can no longer do now because I waited.
I would say probably the biggest thing, I wish I hadn't waited so long into my program to make the decision that I wasn't going into academia, which for me, it was probably like my 4th year, which was in a sense midway. And I know I had inklings before then. And I don't know what I could have done better, but maybe, sought out more resources if they were there. I'm sure they were there at Maryland, but that would be one. The second thing is, if it's possible, to potentially make sure whatever your research is, as far as your dissertation, how can it be like transferable to the real world, or to at least relatable to something that's practical. So my degree was, as I mentioned before, was political science, and so I kind of studied something that was very historical. It had a current component, but none of my current job, or not my current job, neither my previous job, had anything to do with the dissertation at all. So, and I don't know if having a different topic would have helped, or changed my trajectory, but that could be something too, in terms of when you're thinking about what your dissertation is, especially if you already know you're not going into academia. That could at least help you think about how to, direct your path and what way you want to go. So.
Raymond, I really appreciate that. And I want to remind everybody to send me questions in the chat, or put them in the chat so we can sort of guide the conversation more towards the needs of the participants here today. But I do have a follow-up to that, Raymond. And I'm really glad you mentioned that. And maybe this time when we go through this question, we can sort of start with you, since you kind of opened this can of worms a little bit, and I want to exploit it a little bit. One of the biggest things that PhD students within the School of Public Policy come to me about, and it's almost like they kind of I must feel like they feel like they're outing themselves a little bit when they come to me and they say, Brian, I don't want to work in academia. I want to go somewhere else. But I'm having a really hard time finding faculty that understand that, support that, and can help me on that. What do I do? And it seems like that's a constant theme, even within public policy, where we only put about 1/3 of our grads into academia, and the rest honestly go to the feds, or they go to large NGOs or multilaterals in the DC area. So, I guess my question to you is, that seems like I saw some thumbs up here in the room and some head shakes and so forth. Like, it seems like that's a common theme of need across many doctoral programs. How do you have any best practices, or do you have any lessons learned from still receiving quality guidance and mentorship and support from faculty, even though you're kind of going in a what would be considered to many of them as sort of a non-traditional route? And then we'll get to the other panelists too.
Okay. I think for me, and probably that what contributed to my hesitancy was that I had grad students that were farther along in the program that says, hey, if you want to go outside, don't tell anybody. And so that kind of was something that just kept being, reciprocated to the newer people coming in. So you kind of get in this mindset that if you don't tell someone, or if you do tell someone, they won't help you as much as someone who might be going into academia. And for me, there were some professors who kind of knew that I wasn't, and so they didn't have an issue with it. They were like, that's a good route to go. I mean, if you want to go in this field, you know, it's beneficial. I mean, I think that probably the biggest thing would be is take the fear out of it. I mean, all faculty members are people too, right? So they're not going to like, I mean, I would hope they wouldn't like be, you know, retaliatory or anything like that. But I think if you go to them in the sense that you are upfront and honest about your career goals, you know, they'll help you as much as they can. I think the biggest thing for them is that since they've never, in most cases, they probably never have been in the non-academic setting, and they won't really know how to help you. And maybe it's gotten better. Maybe they know people who they can refer you to help you in those situations. But yeah, it's still a difficult balance. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but maybe some of the other members do.
I mean, I had.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Alessandra. Go ahead.
I had the same conversations with my PIs, and honestly, the first person who even told me that a science policy career was possible was from the School of Public Policy, was not from my department. So I took a class, the science policy class that was 50% policy students, 50% scientists. Mm-hmm. And then like I learned that this was a career because no one in my, not even department, no one in my entire school was going to tell me it was a career because that's not something they'd ever considered. And all of their friends are academics too. So reaching outside of your school is very important. But also my PIs were not against me not being in academia because they were seeing it was a trend with my generation of graduate students that we were all not interested in academics. But if you weren't going into industry, they would just raise their hands up and be like, well, I don't know anyone. And I'm like, I know that you are friends with the president of the National Academies of Engineering. He's doing policy. And they're like, yeah, but he's an academic though. So like they think they don't know people. And you have to look in their like LinkedIn and be like, can you connect me to that person? They're doing the thing I want to do. You just don't recognize it as such. And also some professors who have left academia don't necessarily think that going outside of academia is a good idea. For example, my father, who used to be a professor, he left academia. And then when I said I didn't want to be an academic, he was like, that's a weird choice. Why are you doing that? Despite the fact that he's done it himself. So there's a lot of typecasting careers, even for people who are in alternative careers. So there is kind of a little bit of fighting back on multiple different sides. If you have immigrant parents, they will occasionally not understand why you're going from science to policy. But it's nothing that can't be overcome by just showing them that it's viable, even though they've never heard of it before.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. Adria?
Yeah, I want to echo everything that Raymond and Alessandra both said, and kind of build off some of the pieces of parts that they addressed. I was really happy that Raymond brought this up because I was hoping to get to this, and I'm really glad that I'm getting able to get to this, is that I want to encourage everybody basically to be brave. So I'm unique in that I came into graduate school in my application saying that I wanted to do science policy and that I was getting a PhD so that I could eventually work in the government. And so I already knew when I was meeting with mentors that like, I will not be an academic. I will be going into science policy, and they were very aware of that. And I definitely tried to take opportunities that were available to me in order to get me to that end goal. And so I was definitely like intentionally pursuing that path, and didn't find resistance towards it, mostly because I was so outspoken about the path that I had already seen for myself years ago before even beginning graduate school. But in encouraging everyone to be brave, I just wanted to tell everybody that you don't need to be scared of your mentor, because really like your PhD experience, it is for you. It is your career pathway. It is the skills you want to build so that you can have the life that you want, whether that's, working in a nonprofit, working for the government, working at a multinational corporation in one of their offices that deals in policy and works with Congress. Like, there's so many different pathways that you can pursue in policy, in advocacy, and just kind of like pursuing those opportunities when they arise, I think is the most important thing to think about, rather than, the fear that you might have of telling your PI about your career pathway, is really just like being open to the opportunities that are going to present themselves. So, like, for example, Alessandra mentioned a few of the fellowships, but and she'll feel the same way as I do about this, is that they're not the only pathway into science policy. And I think that that's also important, and it's getting to something that she touched on, which is that, like, you should feel fulfilled in your life when you've achieved the goals for yourself and not achieved goals that like somebody else thinks are important. So that might be exactly, she doesn't intend on doing a fellowship at all. And so you don't need to have, the most common is the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. You do not need to have that in order to be successful in science policy or in policy in general. You don't have to come from a science field in order to do that. But I just want to like encourage everybody to like be brave, take opportunities they present themselves, and don't view failures as the end of your road. I applied to, I don't even know, at least 10 of these types of fellowships without getting them. I've applied to be an editor for free for science policy journals. Haven't gotten accepted to those, but I'm still just gonna like keep those connections, keep trying, keep reapplying, and see where these things can take me, and I've had different opportunities present themselves. Like, I have a full-time job now that I love, and there are hopefully other things that'll come down the path as I progress through my career, and just trying to be open to those. And I think sometimes it can be scary, especially if you're like a working parent, you're the sole, provider for your family. You have, a different immigration status. So I'm a US citizen, so there's flexibility there, right? Like, I don't need a job. I can transition and do an internship that won't sponsor my visa. And so taking all those things in consideration and not feeling like if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you must be a failure. Like, you can make it into policy doing multiple paths and work in that area at any point in time in your career, even after being a professor. You can do a Jefferson Science Fellowship through the State Department. So there's always going to be a pathway for you to like engage in policy if that's really what you want to do. So I just want to encourage everybody to do that and be brave.
Yeah, and can I just talk about something Adria brought up? One of the things, when you think of science policy, especially if you're like someone from a STEM background who hasn't been around a lot of policy before, you tend to think politicians. And those are not very stable career paths. As like a staffer or an advisor to a politician, you're shuffling around like every 4 to 8 years. But that's not all there is. Policy has stable jobs. And that's one of the big things I got pushback on, because people were like, you're going to have to constantly be job searching, because like, what if the administration changes? Are you going to stay on? Are you going to work for someone you hate? And I'm like, I'm not going to work in the White House. There is policy outside of the White House. Also, people in the White House don't all change each administration, because there are some things that are consistent long term. But like, there's this outside perception that it's constantly shifting when it's not. Think tanks are often very, very stable. Some of them vary based on like funding, but they're pretty stable. Like the departments, if you're not the head of a department, you're probably in a stable career. It's not this like ever fluctuating space that a lot of people think it is.
Yeah, Alessandra, I think that's a great point. I would echo that by saying working on Capitol Hill is probably number 10 or 11 on the most popular list of destinations for our alums. They're much more likely to head to a number of other places. And that stability that you're talking about students getting, I mean, that's when they're in the federal agencies and you have a number of levels of separation between an administration that you may or may not agree with. There is some, not only security, but also some distance between things that you might not sort of see eye to eye on, but can still do your job and do it effectively and help serve the policy area that you feel like is important. So I thank you for that. Questions right now, or I have a follow-up to something Adria said probably 3 or 4 times that I want to pick up on. Questions? Okay, she said be brave. Okay, and she said that like 3 or 4 times, and I want to take that in a different direction. One of the things I like to talk to my policy students about when they are job searching and interviewing is leveling the playing field of the interview, right? Like when you're younger, you're an undergrad, you might feel like the employer's up here and you're down here, and you're just desperate for any experience, you're desperate for a job. I mean, like, and I talk a lot about sort of counterbalancing that and knowing that you are a wanted quantity and that you have skills that are going to be of interest to the employer, and that should impact how you approach the interview, that should impact how you describe yourself, and also the questions that you ask. And so on that last point there, I want to know if the 3 of you focused, since you're looking outside of academia, right? Since you went outside of academia where it's kind of a known closed system, since you're looking across places, like AIR and the Election Commission and so forth, how did you gauge things like organizational culture, work-life balance, commitment to diversity, inclusion and belonging, as far as any number of different ways of thinking about these very, very, I think, especially now, important issues. It's easy to make a website that says we have these things and look at us, we're great. It's a lot different when you're interviewing and you're really talking to people there, and you're kind of getting vibes one way or the other about what your life is going to be like if you take a job there, and how you're going to manage. I think Adria, you said if you've got kids or whatever, or what is it like to be a woman at this organization that may have sort of a spotted past with regards to sort of gender issue. I mean, like, how did you guys incorporate those things into your job searches? Would be helpful for us to hear, I think. Take that any different direction you want. I know it's kind of a loaded question.
Okay, I can start. I have been very lucky in that I have talked to the CEO of every organization I've worked for before I worked there. So mostly I work in small companies. So there's not like a whole lot of people to reach out to the CEO. But like I've had a kind of, not necessarily a working relationship, but like I've known them, I've heard them talk at conferences. That's how I learned about a lot of these. I go to a lot of science policy conferences, and now they're all virtual, so they're easy to access. And I went to their talks. I perhaps, like, for example, the Science Policy, Canadian Science Policy Center, I volunteered for them for a year and a half before I started working with them. So I had a pretty thorough understanding of how they work. Obviously, being paid is different from volunteering. There is a significant shift in expectations and culture, but you get a sense for how the group is organized. And then places like AAAS, like Sudip is super reachable. He's the current CEO. And like I followed him on Twitter and like met him at a conference and talked. And when I was an intern, he sat me down and was like, just chatted with me to get a sense of like how I was adapting. So each time I've been specifically targeting places where people at all levels were open to talking to me, regardless of if I was employed or not, and how high up I was. And then for places where I'm looking for in the future, I keep maintaining that. I reach out directly to who I would be supervised by or hire and try to talk to them before I apply, which is kind of a position of privilege because I have the ability to like put that much time into an application. But if you have that time and that ability to reach out to people, absolutely do it, because it is probably the best way to gauge someone, is to just talk to them for 30 minutes about what they do, what they like about their work, that kind of stuff, because you get a lot of input from body language, how they phrase things, etc.
Thank you. Raymond or Adria, do you guys have anything to want to add?
I'll chime in. I just wanted to like thank you for like distilling some of my probably ramblings down to that, because I do think it's really important to to let students know that they're valued. Like when you're coming out of your master's or PhD program, like you have a skill set, and the reason they're interviewing you is because they want you. So, I think during my PhD, I definitely felt like, sometimes I wasn't always, getting that pat on the back that you're used to in in undergrad or high school. So you feel like I must be doing something wrong, or you're valuing yourself based on like your research, but that isn't the case. You obviously have something that they want. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking the time to call you on the phone or to schedule an in-person interview with a panel of people to talk to. They wouldn't waste their time with you if they didn't feel like you were going to be a good fit. So come in knowing that you have value, and that's why you're there. And with that being said, I think, just a few points that I'd like to add. When I came into my first interview, essentially, like, I knew that I came in with a lot of really good skill sets in a physical science, and working as a policy analyst, which is my title, tends to be relatively underpaid across the DC area. And so, especially like in nonprofits, they just, they don't have a ton of funds. And so you might get paid more in the federal government, but in the nonprofit area, you don't get paid as well, generally. Now, when I was at AIP for the interview, I made sure to basically ask essentially, like, what is your work-life balance? I asked it in a way that said, what is the team's normal working hours? Which I think is a common way to phrase it, just to, like, you don't necessarily want to give the perception that you're have, certain things that'll restrict your ability to be flexible, which is something that tends to be key for a lot of different positions, that they want you to be flexible for the work. And so I definitely asked about that. And I was pretty upfront about, wanting to maintain a sane work-life balance, for example, like not generally working on weekends and not being expected to reply to emails around after, like, 5 p.m. But that changes because, right, like, for example, President Biden put out his budget request a few weeks ago on a Friday evening. Well, that meant that I needed to read that budget request to get those numbers updated in our system that evening. So, that doesn't happen all the time, but it happened at that point. So just, like, needing to be flexible, but also knowing that, you should still get to, like, stand up for yourself. So if you don't want to be working on weekends, make sure that you're asking those questions, or getting to that point at least partially when you're looking for these jobs. The other thing I wanted to add is the negotiation bit. Because you're coming in with value, when you get offered your first salary, especially, if, again, I'm lucky. I'm in a point of privilege. I came in with a physical science PhD. I'm a US citizen. I didn't have to take a job. I opted to take a job at that point before finishing my PhD. And so I basically, essentially played hardball with them and told them that, like, your initial offer is too low and I'm not willing to accept anything lower than this amount, which was on parity with what my peers were getting at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they thought that that was fair. I cited an example where this is what my peers are making. I want to make that much money in order to, maintain, the standard of living that I think I should have moving forward with my life. And they were obviously willing to accept that, and I took the job. So I think just knowing that you're coming in with value, and if you can and feel comfortable to negotiate and also be upfront about, like, your, the life that you want to have outside of work.
Great advice. I'm actually writing some of this down because as I'm hearing what both of you all just said, I'm like, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. For me, how it's worked for me is that some of my experiences have I saw more of work culture after I got in, and I didn't necessarily ask too much about that during the interview, but I did make it a point of always asking the question, during that time when they say, do you have any questions for us? I would ask something to the effect of, what are you currently working on now? I think it was something like, what excites you about coming into work, or something of that nature. And you can kind of get a sense as to whether or not someone is, given a fake answer, or they're really genuine about working there. Because sometimes I remember, even for my current job, I remember I asked that question, and someone said about the people, you know, they enjoy working with the different people. And so when I got into the actual job, I saw that even though that everybody comes from a variety of different backgrounds and experiences, there was a nice community atmosphere there that people got along pretty well. So, um, so yeah, that'd be the advice I would give for that.
Yeah. And also beyond contacting your supervisor in a potential position, contact your peers. So a lot of what I did when I was looking at jobs was I would go on LinkedIn and I would find the person who would be in charge of me and the people who they are currently in charge of. And I'd contact all of them on LinkedIn and be like, I saw the job posting, and then link it so they know the specific one. Do you have a little bit of time to chat about it? I'm really interested in the specifics of the position. And just send that as the connect message to a bunch of people. Not all of them are going to respond, but in policy, a pretty large percentage will, because you tend to get jobs through informational interviews. If you don't do informational interviews, your odds of getting the job are dramatically lower, because the entire policy space is name recognition. So if they've already met you, they recognize your name.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I probably do between 15 and 20 LinkedIn introductions a week for my contacts here in the DC area. And what I require my students to do is to submit to me a couple paragraphs about themselves as if written by me. I edit the front and the back based on my knowledge of the contact, and I connect us on a three-way chat in LinkedIn. And usually within hours, especially during COVID, within hours, the contact responds to the three-way chat, and the two of them take it offline for another Zoom or whatever they're going to be doing, a distance coffee or whatever. And that is the currency of DC. And if you're not comfortable with it, you know, you need to work on figuring out a way to become comfortable with it, because it is definitely an art form. Networking is certainly a piece of the job search that is essential in DC. And that's why coming up at 3:45, I think we have some opportunities for you guys to do some information interview-like sort of situations with some of our alums that are here today. So I'm gonna pause and take a temperature check real quickly. Ashley, Heather, Amy, Annie, everyone else, do you guys, are there questions that you have that you want to take over? Because I could ask questions all day, but if it's not what you guys want to hear, then it's no good. So let me pause for a second, see if anybody wants to pop in and ask some questions to direct our conversation.
Hi, first, thank you guys so much for doing this panel. And then I guess I feel like I'm in a similar position as some of the stories you guys were telling about how you got into science policy. I'm in plant sciences, and I'm kind of like, oh, I like don't want to do academia, and like I don't want to do this. And like I guess kind of what qualities or like working conditions or like working cultures did you see in science policy that like attracted you to that?
So as someone who found it during her PhD, me wasn't working culture or anything. It was, I had low level science policy exposure during my PhD. So I took that science policy course with Rosina Bierbaum. Excellent. If it's still happening, it usually happens in the spring, take it. I was tapped to testify for one of the unionizing pushes that we had. And I'm not a good public speaker. I have stage fright. I was stared down by a Senate committee and asked to testify. And it was really fun. Like, it's not something I thought would be fun at all. And then I loved it. And we had to wait the entire day listening through all of the different, the other bills being put through. And everybody was like, I don't know about everybody, but there's some people who are just like, oh my God, this is taking forever. And I was just sitting there like, wow, this is so interesting. And then I started watching the House Committee on Science, Space and Technology YouTube hearings. So now I have a YouTube alert for them. every time I do anything, I just listen to it while I work. And then I helped institute a new policy in my department because I felt like there was a significant gap that was allowing for some mild mistreatment of grad students. And I got my policy through. So like I had these kind of small things that were science policy light that I did sporadically throughout my PhD. And that's what made me like it. Because I realized like I do my research mechanically because I need to, but those things were fun. I should probably look into doing more of those instead of the mechanical, like robot existence of the wet lab that I was starting to have.
I'll just go ahead, Raymond. I don't want to like step on you if you want to reply. But thanks for your question, Amy. Actually, I would say that I don't think the culture of academia or like policy in general are really that different. Like it's the same people, right? In the same institutions and the same systems that are creating the same, you know, mistreatment that you might feel in academia. What's different is the different sectors that you could go into, like industry or nonprofits or government. So and also different business cultures. So like if you went into industry, it's gonna be very business specific how you feel the culture is there. So like at the American Institute of Physics, when I came on, they had just started working on putting together a report about Black student representation in physics and how they could help address that persistent underrepresentation in physics. And then they just recently started a foundation in order to fund some of that work. And so obviously, like I knew coming in that, okay, this organization shares the same values that I have. And I'm going to be happy there and be able to come to work and be myself without feeling like, you know, I need to hide part of myself. And I think that that's probably also an important thing that I was able to get at for the American Institute of Physics just by, looking at what they do, what are their mission statements, but also where are they putting their money, who are they hiring, do they use gendered language on their website, like all of those things to make sure that like I felt comfortable. I even during the interview was very conscious of the fact of like who's in the room with me during this interview. So like is it all white men or not? And it wasn't. So I felt like, okay, then it's not just diversity for diversity's sake. It's like they're actually talking the talk and walking the walk. So that made me feel more comfortable being at AIP specifically. And I think that that's where kind of like I wanted to flip your question on the head, and that like I don't think policy actually is really that different, and some of the biases that people have are still persistent in policy communities. I would say, for example, like the disability community still has a very challenging time getting hired for government roles. There's still a lot of bias in all forms of communication related to in the policy area. You might even notice like physical barriers for people's access to buildings still when you're interviewing. There's all these things that are still going to come up for like marginalized groups. And so just making sure that when you're interviewing for a place, whether that's in the policy community or not, that you're, speaking up when you see those things, or working at a place that you feel represents your values. And if it doesn't, maybe advocating to make that change internally.
So I'm not of a science policy background, but for me, I'd say I took an internship while I was in grad school, and that was originally with CRS, which then led into a position I had for a short time there that was paid. And so one of the cool things about that was that because academia teaches you to be so focused on one very narrow area or issue area, or whatever your discipline is in, you feel like you can't learn a lot outside of that. And so when I was in this internship, I was able to broaden my I wouldn't call myself an expert on some of the topics, but I did broaden my scope of my knowledge in certain areas. And so, and which included elections. And so I would assume that helped, when I applied to the current job I'm in, even though I still was not an expert in elections by any means. So yeah, I would say kind of try to become, obviously you're a specialist, but also become a generalist in some respects, so that you can see that people can see that you're, that you can pick up things easily, so.
And for Wei Ping's question in the chat, what Raymond said is basically spot on. Read the text of the position outline. If, for example, it says qualifications, economics for a data analyst position, they want a specialist. If in the qualifications they say every degree known to man, they want a generalist. They don't care what your background is. So modify how you apply based on how specific to a discipline their wording is. Because especially in think tanks, it varies widely. Sometimes they want a subject matter expert. They'll be like, we want someone who is going to write reports on 5G and only that. You need to have an existing knowledge of 5G policy, the mechanisms around it, etc. And then sometimes they'll be like, for example, there was recently one in the Congressional Library Service where they wanted education report generation. That's immensely broad. Anyone who's been to graduate school can probably handle that. So it's kind of like, there is no one set of criteria. You just kind of gauge how specific you have to be based on it. So I will apply to things that do not necessarily list my degree in the qualifications if they seem to be talking in more vague terms. But if it's very, very specific and my degree is not listed, I'm probably going to get screened out and it's not worth my time.
Yeah, and I think building off of what Alessandra just said, I do think you should still take that chance. I definitely put out a lot of applications in the first 2 years. I would say so November 2018 is when I was hired into my job at the American Institute of Physics, but I think I at least put out 32 applications across DC to nonprofits, think tanks, my professional societies, all the fellowship programs I could think of in science policy, several government jobs that were definitely above my pay grade at the time, because I think Raymond could probably speak to USA jobs a bit more than I can. But that's a whole separate hurdle to overcome. But I do think taking the experiences that you have and leveraging them in a different way, which was something Susan talked about at the opening of this whole conference, I think is an important thing to do. And then, be willing to just apply for something, even if you may not be 100% a good fit, because I do think sometimes positions close. I applied for a job on USA Jobs and I thought I'm definitely going to get an interview, but then they ended up not even taking anyone for the job. They closed the application, and that's fine, but that means at least I know that if they open it up again, maybe I will be that fit, or maybe the hiring manager will remember me or something. So those kinds of things I think are always important. And maybe Raymond can talk to the government specific parts a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll just for USA Jobs, it definitely varies depending on the agency. I've had job when I was applying a couple of years ago, I had jobs where I applied and you would get referred, or you'll get a notification that you've been referred, and then it was the next day they would say you're not qualified or something. I'm like, wait a minute, you just referred me. So and then other times you'll never hear from them at all, and it'll be a whole year later where they'll say they moved on to someone else. And then my current position, this was an interesting one where they posted on USA Jobs, but you actually didn't apply through the system. You sent your resume or whatever your job documents and so forth to a person, or a resume, email address, or whatnot, and they had their own internal thing. So it really kind of just depends on the agencies. And some agencies have internal processes where they have a computer that scans your resumes to see if it fits certain the job description, and they do keyword searches. I know the Library of Congress does that. So yeah, it's a very interesting portal.
I'll just pop in here and add just one thing really quickly to that question that was asked in the chat. And I don't think I heard anybody mention it yet, but if many of you are coming from other areas of campus and are looking to enter into the policy world, become very familiar with the words transferable skills. Okay, so if you're looking at a think tank and you're coming from journalism, and that means that you can possess, or that you possess, strong analytical or writing or organizational or strategic thinking or planning or communication or presentation skills, those kinds of things. I mean, that's exactly what is going to be music to the ears of somebody who is in a think tank is going to want from you, right? And to be frank with you, I think all too often people who are coming from a non-traditional area into policy think that that's a disadvantage. It is not a disadvantage. Okay, it's kind of like the consulting firm that only hires MBAs, right? Whenever a consulting firm gets somebody who does not have an MBA, they just jump for joy because it's somebody who thinks differently. It's somebody who brings in a different set of perspectives. It's somebody who's been trained differently academically, right? You're bringing a whole different set of skills to the organization, and frankly, that's an important piece of the diversity that the organization presents as well, right? Like being able to have that sort of offering and capture that as a positive, as opposed to worrying about it being a negative. That changes the whole paradigm of your job search, and I think can make it much more successful. So I would encourage all of you to work with career counselors in your schools and colleges to kind of internalize that and make that part of your strategy. I feel like I'm offering a group career counseling session. I don't mean to, but that is exactly what is important for all of you for job searching, is thinking about those transferable experiences, education, leadership, all kinds of things in your background, and how it's relevant for the current job. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it for my current job. Like my boss previously only hired people who were in like the science of science and bibliometrics space. And then they came across my application and they were just like, she has all the same background like qualifications, but she's a biochemist. We study how people who get NIH grants operate, but we've never talked to one before. And that's, I think, a large part of why they selected me, because they could finally have the perspective of the person they studied in their analysis. And that required them stepping completely outside of like their safe boundaries that they've previously operated under. So being different is not necessarily bad. It can sometimes be the reason why you're picked.
Well, I think we're running up on the very end of our hour here. I want to mention a couple of things. I'm putting in the chat right now an evaluation for this session, that if you have a few minutes at some point after we're done here, or later on this evening, if you would complete that evaluation, it should take about a minute or two. That'd be wonderful. I'm also, I wouldn't say required, but excited to mention the fact that from 3:45 to 4:30 today, small group conversations with alumni is occurring, where you can ask them anything, much like a Reddit. It's wonderful. I love it. Attendees are going to be given the opportunity to sort of do small group information interviews with alumni. Great practice for you to share advice about networking, transitioning from grad school, and gaining experience with others. Pretty impressive list of alumni that are listed there, and I encourage you to take advantage of that. And we're also, later on this afternoon, I will be hosting for the 4:30 to 5:30 networking session, one on from the school public policies perspective. So if you want to talk to me more, if you haven't had enough yet, and you're available later on this afternoon, I encourage you to come back and spend some time talking more in a more informal setting, so that we can do some networking together. And I'd finally like to say, Adria, Raymond, Alessandra, you guys were wonderful. Thank you so much for all the information that you shared. It was very, very helpful. And hopefully those of you that are in attendance here have noted some names here so that you're trolling them on LinkedIn right now and hoping to connect with them so that you can carry the conversation after we're done here. I'm sure all three of them will be happy to lend themselves to you in that way. So thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it, everybody.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Ray.
thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.